course, I spilled water. Good evening. Hi, welcome to the Lafayette Library and Learning Center. My name is Sarah Blumenfeld, and I work for the Lafayette Library and Learning Center Foundation. And before we get started, I'd like to just ask everyone to please make sure you silence your cell phones for the evening. The foundation, in addition to raising approximately 52% of the operating budget for the library, also produces programs like tonight's Distinguished Speaker Series. There are several other programs taking place this month, and I just want to mention them quickly to you. We have the founder of the Maker Movement, Dale Doherty, coming. We have several environmental writers, Mary Ellen Hannibal, Nathaniel Johnson, and Jason Mark. And on October 26th, we have Senator Barbara Boxer here. There are flyers in the lobby for all of those programs, and if you are not currently receiving our weekly program newsletter, we also have the opportunity to sign up for that in the lobby before you leave. The Lafayette Library is more than the bricks and the books. It's a really valuable community gathering place, and it's a place of lifelong learning for everyone. Tonight, we're fortunate to be gathered together for the pleasure of meeting a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet and writer. This program was made possible through a partnership with St. Mary's College MFA in Creative Writing program. I want to thank Candace Eros-Diaz and Sarah Mamolo from St. Mary's MFA program for introducing us to tonight's speaker. This is the second year we've collaborated on a program. It's one of the things I look forward to every year, and it's been a pleasure to work with Sarah, and I look forward to what we're going to do next. And now I'd like to turn the stage over to Marilyn Abelskoff. She is a professor at St. Mary's in creative nonfiction, and she's going to give you a little introduction to our tonight's speaker. So please welcome Marilyn.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Born in Massachusetts and raised in Fairfield, California, Tracy K Smith earned her BA from Harvard and an MFA in creative writing from Columbia. She teaches writing at Princeton University and lives in Brooklyn with her husband and children. She's the author of 3 books of poetry, including Life on Mars, which won the 2012 Pulitzer Prize for Poetry. Her work has also been honored by too many awards to name here, a very long and distinguished list. Elizabeth Alexander said of her poetry that Smith synthesizes the riches of many discursive and poetic traditions without regard to doctrine and with great technical rigor. Her poems are mysterious and utterly lucid. Terence Hayes calls Smith a meditative poet unlike any of her generation. Her latest book has been shortlisted for the National Book Award. It's the memoir Ordinary Light, about which the New York Times Book Review said she offers a painstaking reflection on what went into the making of her. In delicate prose, the memoir offers a loving and forthright picture of family, of Smith's abiding and faithful mother, of Smith herself, who was the baby of the family, a good girl, a girl for whom belief was stitched in, and what it felt like to grow up and leave home and live her own life, honestly, unapologetically, as she writes, doing exactly as she pleased. She tracks through her earliest memories as a tiny satellite to her mother's body, through adolescence and a charged relationship with an English teacher in high school, and then that inevitable taste of freedom in college as she pulled away from her mother, who would die too soon. It is a book that refuses to separate the life of the body from the life of the spirit or the life of the mind, a book about race and faith and family, about power and prayer, education as a first taste of cruelty, history, racial injustice, and the pain that is part of one's birthright, the pain we hate most, as she writes, because we know it has been borne by the people we love. Books are about claiming power, Smith writes, the power to name and state and face the events, even the most awful events making up a life. This has happened to me, she writes, and because I can see it and can call it up and face it again for you and can stand my ground while I sift through it for nuance and meaning, I am stronger. Telling my story, standing here and telling it to you now, she says, is both a prayer for power and an answer to that prayer. Smith writes about her own prayers and her own yearnings and her own failings and awakenings, how she was marked by language, and fittingly, it is her mother who on her deathbed predicts that Smith will become a writer. It is an astonishing moment by an astonishing writer, someone who asks, is God each of the many things we see in the course of a life, family for a short time, and then independence, and then love? To read her work is to remember what Philip Larkin once wrote, to write one song as sad as the wind, for this I must visit the dead. We are so honored. Please join me in welcoming Tracy K Smith.
Thank you so much, Meredith, for such a lovely and generous introduction. And you also saved me from having to frame the memoir, which is really a relief. So maybe I will start by reading a little passage from that. But I also want to say thank you for having me. Thank you, Matthew, and your colleagues, wonderful colleagues that I've met this evening at St. Mary's. It's an honor to come back to what I think of as my home and do this. So, this is a brief excerpt from a chapter in the memoir that takes place in the early 80s when I'm in elementary school, about 9 years old, and it's, I think that's all you need to know. How many of you have ever been to camp before? Ms. Dyer asked. A few hands went up into the air, but mine continued to rest on my desk. You'll need to bring your own toiletries like soap and lotion and toothpaste. I used lotion every day, like most other Black people I knew, to ward off ashy skin. I wondered to myself if a white teacher would have been concerned enough to mention it. And flip-flops for the showers. Oh, and the showers are communal, which means you'll be in there with other campers, boys with boys and girls with girls. Excuse me. Did she hear my heart thumping up against my ribs? She must have, because the next thing she said was that if you didn't feel comfortable showering in front of other people, you could always shower in your bathing suit. My cheeks were hot. This sounded to me like a lose-lose situation. Either I'd be forced to stand naked in front of my peers or else let everyone know how frightened I was to do so. The camp would be held at a place called Whiskeytown and would last a week for all the MGM kids. That was the weird acronym for a gifted program when I was in school, which was called Mentally Gifted Monkeys and Mother's Greatest Mistakes by the kids that, were great at making acronyms. Except as of then, we were no longer known as MGM, but rather GATE, for Gifted and Talented Education, an acronym that proved more difficult to sabotage. Ms. Dyer told us about camp songs and s'mores. She explained how we'd be bunking and that we'd be hiking past beaver dams and waterfalls. There were a lot of other details she rattled off, things that whizzed past me because I was still in a panic about the showers. Despite my trepidation, at home I lobbied for the trip. I really want to go, I assured my mom. I even convinced myself to panic over the possibility that she and my father might find reason to say no. What about your hair? My mother asked. You're not a little white girl who can just shake her head and go. We agreed that a dozen cornrows should keep me from having to struggle too much on my own. Cornrows were a big compromise. The last time I'd worn them, they lasted only one day because I'd insisted on taking them out as soon as my friend next door told me, your hair looks funny. Whiskeytown was a 3-hour bus ride northward into mountainous forest. It was a California I'd never before seen, north past cities and suburban sprawl. There were winding roads and rivers and lakes where gold prospectors, the state's original 49ers, had sought their fortunes. It was beautiful and astounding. I'd never been farther north than Sacramento, and so had no idea that I lived this near to a place that remained so untouched, bare, open fields that appeared more free and alive somehow than the hillsides closer to home. Perhaps it was the utter quiet and the relative absence of traffic that seemed to account for the landscape's autonomy. I wondered whom it belonged to: wealthy ranchers, doctors, and dentists. In my heart, I hoped it was nobody's, that it belonged to itself. It struck me as the kind of place where God might come in order to take stock of his creation: eagles, foxes, centuries-old redwoods. I felt nervous and lucky, sensing this North Country as the kind of place that, if there was any truth to fairy tales or pagan legends, housed the potential for some sort of magic. Magic. That's great. We spent the evening of our arrival singing Up in the Air, Junior Birdman, and On Top of Old Smoky after dinner. It was cold that far north, so we sang our camp songs indoors in a huge cafeteria with a stone fireplace. We slept 4 to a cabin where the sheets and blankets were thin and had a chalky smell about them. One of the counselors, Jill, was the younger sister of my brother Conrad's high school girlfriend. She was like many of my classmates, a white girl from Green Valley with long caramel-colored hair that she managed quite easily enough all by herself. I wondered if she had asked to have me in her group or if it had just been the luck of the draw. Waking on the first morning to the bugle cry, I showered in my bathing suit. But it didn't take long for me to realize that it didn't make sense to wash only the areas that my bathing suit didn't cover. After that, I decided to just wait it out and do a proper job when I got home. The same went for what I still could only refer to as defecating, which I couldn't bring myself to do in the too public for my liking toilet stalls. A few days into the trip, at breakfast with a friend who was in the same boat as me shower-wise, Jill said, "You guys haven't been showering, have you?" When our eyes bulged and we demanded to know who had told her, she looked at us with her eyes the green and brown of glistening jasper and smiled. "Oh, I can just tell." Our campground sat at the center of a more wide-open space than I'd ever before seen, all of it framed by forests of oaks and pines. Each morning, the whole group of us played soccer and Red Rover in a field. Thick fog hovered out across the horizon while the sun was still low. There were gophers popping up from their tunnels and beavers swimming the river, their oily, wet fur glistening in the sun. As the day progressed to a cloudless, clear blue, small groups of us were led on hikes up and down mountain trails. At our guide's instruction, we tasted wild green onions. They grew in bunches and were just as thin as blades of grass, only taller. We crossed running streams, stepping rock to rock. I was frightened to near paralysis by things like walking across logs or climbing down steep, muddy grades, and fell into step near the rear of the pack, hoping to amass the courage while my classmates ahead of me made their way. More than once, my apprehension caused our guide to have to backtrack and help me over whatever small hurdle had gotten the better of me. It was a humiliation, but its sting was still less than the fear I felt at nearly every turn. When my feet got wet and I spent a good part of the day uncomfortably cold, I tried to remind myself that it was nothing short of a miracle that I was there in the first place, nothing shy of an act of God to have been allowed to throw my sleeping bag in with the rest of my class and ride off into a week of more or less self-supervision. Were my parents worried about me up there on my own? 2 days before our time at Whiskeytown was over, Our 4 teachers and the camp director stood before us in the cafeteria. It was dark out, and the fire was crackling, reinvigorating the wood smoke smell that had seeped into the molecules of my hair, clothes, and unwashed skin. "We have a very serious announcement to make," Mr. Samuels said. He was bearded, with ruddy cheeks and a round face, which he just then was keeping perfectly free of expression. "You may already have heard some rumors, but we wanted to be the ones to tell you that one of your classmates, Kenny Moffett, died this morning." Mr. Samuels paused a moment to give our gasps and murmurs time to sound out, though for the most part the room remained silent. My thoughts froze and sped up at the same time. Kenny, the boy I sat beside every day in class, bickering with and making mischief, the boy with the dirty fingernails and the freckle-spattered face. I'd barely seen him since we arrived. It was almost as though I'd expected him still to be sitting there in the darkened classroom, waiting beside my empty desk, though, of course, class, with its chalkboards and corkboards and windows looking out onto the harbor of our schoolyard, now seemed a million miles away. I didn't know what to think or do, so I sat there willing my ears to listen. "Kenny had a mild heart condition," Mr. Samuels continued. He said it like this was knowledge he had had for a long time. "He suffered a heart attack this morning while he and a classmate were out jogging." I could gather who the classmate had been. Ellis, the kid who resembled Andrew Jackson, was Kenny's best friend. The two of them were funny together, working up little comic bits worthy of the Marx Brothers or Bob Hope and Bing Crosby, whom they had studied enough to imitate with a fair degree of accuracy, at least for 9-year-olds. I liked those movies too for what it was worth. Conrad and I sometimes watched them together on TV when he visited for the weekend. Both Kenny and Ellis had older parents, gray-haired mothers with wrinkles like grandmothers, and old man fathers we rarely saw, which might have explained why both boys had such an affinity for black and white movies. Whenever Kenny and Ellis performed one of their funny back and forths, and just as everyone else's laughter was dying down, one boy would ask the other who wrote his material. The answer, no matter the joke, was always Bob Hope, and every time it caused the two of them to grin with a private kind of pride. Mr. Samuels went on to explain that the accident hadn't been anybody's fault, and that Kenny probably hadn't felt a lot in those final moments. He and the other teachers stood together looking out into what must have seemed just then like a sea of some of the youngest, most vulnerable faces in the world. The teachers asked if any of us had questions. They encouraged us to talk about our feelings, to get things out in the open, so that nobody had to feel alone in sorting through a classmate's death. I didn't ask anything, and I didn't cry the way some of the other campers were beginning to. For a moment, I thought that I should, that it would be the decent thing for Kenny's class partner to do, but I couldn't manage it. I felt a strange detachment from myself, unable to feel what such a thing was supposed to feel like. Reality raced back at me. Hadn't Kenny sat next to me less than a week ago? Hadn't we just argued about a broken pencil and about the mess of papers threatening to spill out from his desk? How could he have been in the seat beside me one day, smelling like peanut butter or now and laters, and then simply be gone, disappeared, a world away? I wasn't crying, but I felt for the first time that underneath our show of not liking one another, Kenny and I had actually been friends, and it hurt. Where did death take Kenny? Did he believe, as I did, in God and heaven, or would death have carried him out of obligation somewhere else? My mother would have wanted me to witness to Kenny, to tell him about Jesus, and to behave as an emblem of Christ, but I hadn't. What had it felt like just before he was gone? Did he feel it coming? Had he called out for his mother? What would I do if I knew I was about to be gone? Would I see Jesus there waiting for me just across a stream like the Baptist hymns say? Or would everything have gone dark? And what about the blaze of warm white light people talked about? People like the man and woman I'd once seen on the episode of the Phil Donahue show about near-death experiences. I didn't let myself think about Kenny's body lying lifeless in the grass, or how it would be transported home to his parents. I didn't think about whether his desk would still be there beside mine, only empty, when we returned to school. Something that wasn't any of those things sat upon my mind, making it heavy and dull, sleepy and slow. On the ride home a few days later, I was aware of not sharing in the same feeling that some of the other campers seemed to share, a feeling that lent them an air of uncomplicated belonging and ease. Some sang camp songs, others shouted to each other across the bus rows. All week long, those same kids had bathed and used the toilet without shame or anxiety, falling into perfect step with just about everyone else at Whiskeytown. They'd hiked up and down mountains without getting too worked up about it. And at the end of the week, they'd found perfectly natural ways of talking about what had happened to Kenny, things I'd failed to fit into words or even coherent thoughts. Happy as I was to have run back and forth across the enormous field each morning, and for the moments of awe at the beauty and the bounty of nature, I found myself stuck in a place that defied expression. My worries about tumbling into a stream or down a mountain path, and about being seen in the shower or sleuthed out in the toilet, had rendered me lonely, had sent me scuttling about so much of the time, desperate to get things over with and to keep everyone from noticing me, hoping that would help to keep them from noticing all the ways in which I was so starkly different. Watching the landscape revert to the familiar as we traveled back to Fairfield with one less child in tow, the voice in my mind muttered to itself, "At least I was there." It was a variation of the mantra with which I'd once heralded the new year, "Here I am." At least I wouldn't be in quite the same position on Monday as the one or two kids who had opted out of camp altogether, deciding instead to spend the week at home. "How was Vodka Village?" my sister Wanda asked when I walked through our front door. "Oh, it was fine," I managed, rushing past her to the bathroom. That night, a lot of it came back to me, the wide, grassy field surrounded by oaks and pines, and how, once you stepped foot into the forest, it rang with a startling, living presence. The gophers and mountain beavers, the enormous bald eagles and flocks of honking geese, the rushing water of the creeks. I told my family about how challenging it had been to do some things, like crossing streams by walking across a path of stones or a log balanced between one side and the other. But in the end, I'd done what had been asked of me and had been safe. None of the little feats of daring I'd been put up to in the woods had brought me to any harm. When I told my family about Kenny, it was clear from their faces that they already knew. It helped take my mind off the terrible realness of his dying by imagining that he'd probably been happy when he died, completely unconcerned, just running around in the tall grass with his friend. It helped, too, to decide that he must finally know, if he hadn't known before, how alike the two of us really were. I liked what the survivors of near-death experiences, at least the ones I'd seen that time on TV, had to say, that there was a tremendous light, warm and incomprehensibly bright, calling to them without words, and that they had raced out of their bodies and down a dark tunnel without fear, eager to be absorbed by the light that summoned. The light was alive, they'd said, and it put their minds or their hearts, whatever was left of them, at peace. The ones who had gotten closest to it before being sent back said it had felt like they were going home. So I thought I would share a few of the new poems that I've been working on since, well, kind of during and since the completion of Ordinary Light. A lot of them are thinking about social events, and I think that's normal for me as a poet. This first one I'm going to read is something that was the conditions within which it was written were kind of weird. For a brief period a few years ago, NPR's All Things Considered had a news poet. I don't know if anybody remembers that. You would go and you'd sit in on the meetings, and you'd sit as news was coming in off the printer, and you were tasked with writing a poem that would somehow summarize the day's news, which was a really terrifying thing to do. I remember sitting in this little room working on my poem and having one of the reporters come in and say, "How's it going? Do you want to read it to me?" Which is not how poets usually work. Maybe we should. But this is a poem called New Road Station, and so it takes up some of the images that were triggered in my mind by a story that was about women in southern Nigeria going north because of an internal political conflict. New Road Station. History is in a hurry. It moves like a woman corralling her children onto a crowded bus. History spits go, 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 lurching at the horizon, hammering the driver's headrest with her fist. Nothing else moves. The flies settle in place, watching with their million eyes, never bored. The crows strike their bargain with the breeze. They cluck and caw at the women in their frenzy, the ones who suck their teeth, whose skirts are bathed in mud. But history is not a woman, and it is not the crowd forming in a square. It is not the bright swarm of voices chanting no and now, or even the rapt silence of a room where a film of history is right now being screened. Perhaps history is the bus that will only wait so long before cranking its engine to barrel down the road. Maybe it is the voice coming in through the radio like a long-distance call, or the child in the crook of his mother's arm who believes history must sleep inside a tomb or the belly of a bomb. There's a new anthology that's come out within the last 6 months or so called Monticello in Mind, and it's thinking about Thomas Jefferson and his legacy, and a number of poets have written in that direction, and you can imagine the different concerns and questions and silences that are being prodded by these poems. So this is a sonnet that I wrote for that. It's called Monticello. Every story begins here, a father's face minted again and again until what you have is a nation. People keep saying slavery's complicated, but I don't believe them. At night, I wander the land. The orchard is our father's. Even you, standing, commanding, born emancipated. I see you traipsing the rows some nights too, and when the wind makes that hollow, leaden, begging sound, you falter. Brother, do you ever wonder what created our father? I believe it is stealthy, leonine, a beast mad to devour its own young. The boughs are heavy, slung with fruit upon fruit, untouched. It drops, rots, but first it appears to plead with the ground. I feel, so much of our national conversation, and I teach at Princeton University, and I felt so proud that so much of our students' conversations have really taken up these questions and anxieties that stem from race in our nation, which is something that we haven't even gotten anywhere near to figuring out. So I feel glad that some of these poems are really thinking about that. Especially feels good reading them now as we come upon an election. So these next two poems are poems that are actually kind of paired with the work of Kara Walker. You might remember, well, some of you might remember a few summers ago in New York City, she created a huge sculpture in the old Domino sugar factory. It was a sphinx that was ostensibly made of sugar with the head of a kind of an Aunt Jemima mammy figure called A Subtlety. And she asked many writers to, kind of think about sugar, think about whatever comes to mind in thinking about this project. And so this is a poem that came to me, and it's based on a photo of sugarcane plantation workers in Jamaica in 1891, and that's the title. I would be standing there too, standing, then made to leap up into the air, made to curl and heave and cringe, and I would want to live so badly I would wreck myself, trying to cradle that speck of something, that speck that weighs and sits and turns and grows and cries out to itself, cries out, Lord, or no. I would be standing there like those men, or bent down like that woman bent in half in the foreground. And I would pray, oh, I would pray to my hands and to the God of cane and of shade and of all that is taller than us. The sky that caps them is spiked with stalks. No one talks. They stare at a man I cannot see, whose gaze has conjured me. It is he who told them to stand, and told that one woman to drop back to her work so we might scrutinize the cut leaves that bury her feet. A man's mouth open, mute as halved fruit. All that is said without breath or pitch. What lives blind to that high white sky. What tunnels and creeps and itch beneath the skin, the names of distant kin, eluding the man and me and our camera's greedy lens. And this is a ghazal. I wrote my first ghazal probably about 6 or 7 years ago after having had my students write them. It's a poem that is written in couplets, and there's a pattern of repetition, which you'll hear in this poem. I'd had my students write them for quite some time and finally realized they're actually writing some good poems based on this exercise. Maybe I should try. So this is probably maybe the third ghazal that I've written. It's funny, like there are these things that run through poems. I'm not reading any, I think I'm reading one poem tonight that has a goat in it, but there are like a number of poems of mine that have goats in them for whatever reason. And you'll hear some echoes in this poem of the one that I just read, perhaps because it's thinking about work by the same artist, but probably more likely because it's coming out of this single-minded vocabulary and imagination that is, for better or worse, mine. Ghazal. The sky is a dry, pitiless white. The long, wide rows stretch on into death. Like famished birds, my hands strip each stalk of its stolen crop, our name. History is a ship forever setting sail, and on either shore, mountains of men, oceans of bone, an engine whose teeth shred all that is not our name. Can you imagine what will sound from us, what we'll rend and claim when we find ourselves alone with all we've ever sought, our name? Or perhaps what we seek lives outside of speech, like a tribe of like a tribe of goats on a mountain above a lake, whose hooves nick away at rock. Our name is blown from tree to tree, scattered by the breeze. Who am I to say what in that marriage is lost? For all I know, the grass has caught our name. Having risen from moan to growl, growl to a hound's low bray, the voices catch. No priest, no sinner has yet been taught our name. Will it thunder up, the voice of time, or hide, quiet as bedrock, beneath our feet? Our name, our name, our name, our fraught, fraught name. Oh, I feel sad. There's a poem that, thinking about that image of called Unrest in Baton Rouge that I thought I had printed, but I didn't. Oh well, go home and look at that image online and write a poem about it. Such a beautiful physical corollary to the, I don't know, different energies that we are wrestling with right now. But maybe I will close with a couple of poems that are thinking, I think as I see it, these are poems that are coming out of being a parent and what that means and what that kind of exacts. I'll read one poem that's kind of like, I feel like it's a poem that outs me as a mother with issues or something. Maybe we all are, but you don't always like to go there when you're talking with strangers. But this is a poem about, it's called Wild. Wild. But I want her to be tame. I know, different game. I see her from a distance, the loud, high squeal that spills how she stomps, leaps, runs. It pleases almost everyone. What small gear slows in me, stalls? Is it a matter of damage? Mine. The way my mother made me whisper ma'am and sir, conquer my hands, their animal urge. I never ran wild, obedient child. It took me years, oh, the pleasure was slow, secret, rich, to discover night's cold, black, anesthetizing air. I'm older, feraler, and wrong, I suspect, to want the same for her. This is a poem called After a Line by Goethe. I sometimes feel the weight of this life bearing in and down, a persistence, the little voice needing something and then something else, insisting, the day at our door like a brazen beggar, give all you can spare and then give more. One neighbor out front laughs like a fool, his cloud of smoke drifting slowly in the cold, not disintegrating until it has traveled some way. Sometimes I draw in my breath and sense the edge of what touches us, what we live limbed by, which is sharp and cold like a clean knife, but also heavy, dull, a great stone wall that doesn't budge. Sometimes, against instinct, I feel an immense gladness for everything demanding my surrender, the little voice crying out in thirst, and again, so that what was just offered can be taken away. We are shaped and fashioned by what we love. Like those houses you come upon sometimes in a clearing in the woods, empty, askew, shot through with daylight, roof collapsed under a transgression of vines, foundation churned to rubble by insatiable roots, the ones that always somehow seem to be singing. Thank you so much.
was wonderful.
Thank you.
So I'll just ask a couple of questions because I know the audience will have many more, but I want to start with what's obvious, but I really want to know why you turned to prose to write about your mother. You had written some about your father in poetry, so why a memoir?
I'll make this long story, hopefully short and try and make sense. I had written about 4 or 5 elegies for my mom in my first book, and those were poems that were kind of the distillation in large part of a bunch of elegies I'd been trying to write in grad school, but that were wrong-headed in that they were trying to undo the fact that she was dead. You know, poems that were trying to kind of fix this unfixable situation, and so they failed. And during that time, I had also thought I wanted to try and write maybe some personal essays that would help me kind of figure that thing out. But I just could never get to the place of doing that. You know, I don't think it's possible to figure such a thing out. So those questions I kind of just put aside and said, maybe one day I'll get there. And after I finished my last book of poems, which, as you said, is really thinking about my dad passing away, thinking about what death might feel like to me, or what it might represent in my imagination, I felt a little bit emboldened to go back to those questions. But I knew that if I were to do what I know how to do in a poem, I might end up arriving in some of the same places that I had arrived with my father, or even with those 4 or 5 poems that felt successful from that period of my life. And so I wanted to change the terms that I was dealing with. I wanted to find a form that would force me into different kinds of observations and admissions. And I felt like prose was that form. I wouldn't have recourse to the leaping energy that I love in a poem, but that allows you to kind of leap away from the main subject and go to something else. I wanted to sit in place and get to an articulation of what I had never been able to say.
Can you talk about writing about your mother's faith? It occurred to me after I put the memoir down that religion is often talked about as a kind of parody. And this is a book that takes your mother very seriously and religion very seriously. Mm-hmm. And for me, it was really refreshing to read. Not that there aren't many, many complications along the way, of course, but can you talk about that, the language of faith that's embedded into the book?
It was not even something I was aware of needing to discuss when I said, I want to write about my mom. And then, I took a few steps into that story, and of course, that's a huge, my mother was very faithful, and her faith was one of the anchors in our family life, and so it became the habit of church going and of talking to God when there was something hard going on. And I think maybe at first, because, I'm an artist, I'm someone who comes from this, liberal background, I felt like I needed to distance myself from that. I wouldn't say I was using parody, but there was something that I wasn't willing to claim, which felt wrong. It took me a long time to write myself into a place where I could claim what had been and remains very real to me, and also pose the questions and describe the anxieties that distanced me from the community that church kind of puts you in the middle of. And it felt really good to be writing paragraphs that had the name Jesus in it, knowing that nobody says that, it just felt like a transgression in a way to be talking about that without irony. And it also kind of allowed me to figure some things out. I think that the fact that I was just a brand new mother when I was working on this book and trying to figure out who my mother had been before I really knew her, I think I began to understand that God might have become more real for her when she had kids, in the same way that God became real again for me when I had children and felt so helpless in terms of protecting them in this world and helping them to become who they're supposed to be. So I feel like it was a kind of a gift to be able to come back to that vocabulary and thinking about these things.
It's beautifully put. And what about voice? You talk in the acknowledgments page about your mentor who pushed you to discover your voice in prose. I know there are a lot of writers in the audience, so I'm wondering if you can talk about that, because voice sort of disappears sometimes into thin air. Would we talk about it? It's okay if it does for you too.
Well, as much as I had told myself I wanted to write prose because I didn't want to do what I do as a poet, that's all I knew how to do initially, and so I was doing what I do as a poet, and it wasn't working. And this mentor, who's a German poet and essayist and novelist and cultural critic, Hans Magnus Enzensberger, who's delightfully playful and kind of firm, which is what I needed, would say, no. You need to tell a story. There are characters in this story. What do they say? What do they eat? What is going on outside of the house? And this can't be only in your head. And it was really this great lesson in how to translate some of these urges or impulses that I'd felt into a different form, or even what felt at times like a different language. It was really awful at first, and then increasingly delightful to realize that there's so much space in a paragraph, and that you can not just use images to create this flash of feeling as one does in a poem, but kind of tell what happened and then stop and think about what you've said. And there were all of these things that happen off stage in a poem that I was being made to realize I needed to do in the paragraph, and that was it was exciting to to do that. I now feel like I'm sure this isn't how St. Mary's MFA program is administered, but I was a grad student in the 90s, and we couldn't cross genres. And I thought it was because we had been chosen, like I was special. No, it was because there are 13 spaces for poets, and there are this many teachers, and if you start mixing things up, it becomes a headache. And so it was really exciting to understand that I could just be a writer. I didn't have to have this fidelity to line breaks.
Right, that's a great answer. We should open it up to the audience for their questions.
Writing exercises? I think the writing exercise that I love the most is the simplest and most infinitely repeatable. It's just read something, think about what it does. If you can even get beneath the sense of subject matter to the mechanisms by which these effects are made. What is language doing? What kinds of shifts occur? What is the momentum, and when are those things that are prevalent in the poem or the piece of writing, when are they disrupted? If you can isolate those things, then they become tools that you can apply to your own material. So that's all I do. That's all my students do now, is we'll read something, we'll talk about it closely, we'll enjoy, what it makes us think and feel, but then we'll also say, how did that get built? And then if you can lift that up, then you have an exercise that you can do. So that's what I find myself doing.
What is a guzzle?
Oh. So it's I guess a... Oh, what is a guzzle? I know I'm saying it in an ugly way. Huzzle, I guess people say. It's a form that originated in Urdu that is built of couplets, two-line stanzas that obey a certain meter that doesn't really exist in English, and so in contemporary American guzzles, the lines are of roughly equal length, but there's a word or a phrase that is repeated that sits at the end in a really strict one of the first and second lines, and then in every subsequent couplet, it sits at the end of the second line. And if you're really strict, there's something called a monorhyme, which is one syllable that precedes that. So in the one that I read, our name is the refrain or that repeated line, and then I was a little bit loose, but like crop, op, not, sought, rock, ought, like that sound kind of forms the monorhyme. And then I didn't do this, but then like a really traditional ghazal, the poet will name him or herself in the final couplet. So it's a form that's really interesting because these couplets sit as these kind of discrete units, but they are also creating this space that almost feels devotional or something, where a feeling or an idea can be approached from many different directions. And so the unity of the poem is built of all of these kind of like moments of reflection. So it's a really beautiful form. And the poet, I think, that really brought it into American poetry is the poet Agha Shahid Ali, who I guess kind of like introduced the form to poets in the 90s.
Ms. Smith, who are you reading today?
Today, on my plane from New Jersey, I'm trying to write some more prose, so I was reading a couple of books of short stories, some stories by Joy Williams, and stories by a young writer who has just published her first collection of stories, whose name is Leopoldine Kaur. That book is called When Watched or While Watched, which is really, it's wonderful. Both of those writers are great, but a book of poems that I just taught in my workshop last week is called Look by Solmaz Sharif, another debut book by a young poet that is thinking really chasteningly and movingly and in intimate and also very photographic terms about war, particularly war in the Middle East, and what that does to citizenship here and there, and what it does to language, I guess. Those are just a few people.
It's so interesting to me that you bring up kind of this reluctance to talk about motherhood and parenting and just kind of exposing that, because it seems like parenting and criticism of parenting has become so public now. What other topics do you run into a lot of resistance writing about, and how do you handle kind of that mental resistance?
I feel that when I am afraid to write something, that's what I'm supposed to be writing. So even the memoir, I remember talking to my husband when I was pregnant with our daughter, who's now almost 7, and saying, I want to write this book about my parents, I think. I want to try and tell their story. And I just started sweating. And so I knew that that was what I needed to try and do. When I was working on that book, for whatever reason, it now sounds preposterous to me to say this, but I didn't realize that race was part of that story. But of course it is. And so it was really exciting. I feel like I've written about race in terms that are more remote in my poems, that have to think about like conflict in places, but not about me. And so it was really valuable to think about it in terms of my own life and even things I hadn't really articulated to myself in language, but that I had felt. And that's like, sometimes I'll ask my students, make a list of all the things you don't think you should write about, that you're afraid of, that you that feel taboo for you, and then of course I urge them to pick something from that list, and that's the exercise. So, I mean, I think that that's what writing is for. I mean, it's not really, if we're experts about something, good for you, but I feel like what the process really does is it allows you to reckon with something that is in some ways insurmountable, and that feels productive to say I can make contact with this and see what it can do to me.
How do you go about accepting responsibility for an experience outside of yourself, such as the picture in Jamaica?
I feel like part of that sense of, I don't think of it as responsibility, but like even having permission to step into these other spaces and other stories, I think it requires me to accept that I'm going to get it wrong, that this is not the final word. These people have voices, had lives. And so what the process becomes for me is really about trying to submit to that material, submit to some of the feelings and the sense of unrest that an image like that creates. I've written a number of persona poems in other people's voices, and I think that what that is about for me is trying to practice a kind of empathy, not, setting the story, not setting it straight, because I can't do that, but saying, what does it feel like to live with some of the realities of this life, and what kind of humility does that foster, and what does that do to change my sense of what I think I know, what values or beliefs I might have. I feel like it's productive because it disrupts something. And maybe it also, I'm always trying to find a way in a poem, any poem that's about like a political question, to push back against what I might feel certain of as a citizen. I always say, like, the kinds of things you feel comfortable saying at a dinner party, you have to let go of in order to write a poem about that topic, and you've got to find a way where you can be complicit with the problem. And then the poem might be getting under your skin in the right way. So I'm hoping something like that happens. I mean, who knows if it can't happen every single time, but I feel like the intention is valuable.
I can't believe we're out of time, but we are out of time. But you'll stay to sign books, is that true?
Maybe just one more question here.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Oh, sorry, getting there with you. Have you ever endured writer's block? And if so, how have you dealt with it in some of your own written essays?
Oh, yeah. Everybody. I had the first and worst writer's block probably about, 15 years ago. I just couldn't, I was just so self-conscious. I was tired of getting my poems back in workshops with like everything crossed out except for like one word or something. And I just stopped. And it felt very painful, that kind of silence, but I ended up turning to another art form for a while. I turned to photography, and that, now I feel like my poems are really relying on what visual imagery can foster, because that was such a great way of thinking about the world. Now if I'm stuck, I just feel like it means I need to stop and learn something else and become curious about something else. So I'll try and do what it takes to make that happen, read or take in some other kind of experience or information or art.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Tracy's going to be available for signing at the back of the room, and we do have ordinary lights for your
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thanks, and thank you for that introduction. That's really so well written.
And the new poetry, I would have loved to do more about that. It sounds different than the earlier books, but I couldn't put my finger on how. I wondered if you knew.
Yeah, I don't know yet.
Right in the middle.
Too soon to tell, but hopefully I'm writing.
Thank you. It's
Oh, thank
amazing.
you. It's great to meet you.
Thank you.
Once again.
David's really good at this. He can do it.